My grandparents were the ones who really pushed for me to go to art school. My father wanted me to go into, just work professionally in a committed job, a trade. But my grandfather, this coal miner who, came over in 1912, was like, it's Billy's life. If he wants to be an artist, let him, go to art school. So that's when I stayed with my grandmother after my grandfather passed away and worked and made enough money to go to pay for my way to go through art school. But because I'd gotten a scholarship to go to Rutgers, and I checked into their art, school credentials and stuff, and it was like they had like liberal arts, but I said I just want, it was almost like going into a vocational technical school. I felt like I could have gone into the sciences or like a college, but I was so committed. I knew that I wanted to be an artist, so I was almost like, just get me into an art school. A pure art school. And the school in Newark was called Newark School of Fine and Industrial Arts. It was an arts, there was Arts High, which was music, jazz, dance. Savion Glover, the dancer, went there. Melba Moore, the singer, went there. It was like, and I could still remember painting and drawing, doing life drawing, and hearing all this jazz coming from the lower floors, And we'd also have days where we'd just listen to jazz music and paint. And that's actually when I started smoking and drinking pretty heavily. I fell in love with illustration, Bernie Fuchs, and guys doing stuff for Sports Illustrated, or work that you would see all the time weekly, like back in the day of magazines, the height of magazines, like before everything went digital, obviously. You'd see a painted cover on TV Guide, by Bob or Bob Peak or Bernie or whomever. The Saturday Evening Post or Look magazine with Norman Rockwell, or women's magazines with different illustrations and stuff in them. And Sports Illustrated, movie posters. It was like, this was the heyday. And also, I would go to museums and just get into painting, painters and stuff. So it became like this incredible sponge, that I became, trying to just absorb everything. When I was growing up, it was like comics were my refuge, and art was, art. And I studied it, but I think it wasn't until I went to school that I sort of, everything just blew wide open in terms of art. It's dance, it's music, it's everything. And I thought, well, I've always loved comics. That was always sort of like my fallback, and I said I wanted to do comics, and it wasn't until I got to art school and I thought about painting, and I wanted to learn about color. So I realized it was I still love comics, and I remember telling one of my friends, I said, I want to get into comics, and I said I want to be a combination of Neal Adams, Bob Peak, Bernie Fuchs, and Robert Rauschenberg, and in a weird kind of a way. And I still remember. Like I was in my second year and I had a game plan about what I wanted to do, and in a weird kind of a way, it's sort of exactly what happened. So not that I was at all prescient, but I just knew that like when kids are young, they go like, I want to be an astronaut. I want to go, combine. I had like this idea of wanting to do certain things. School was over at the beginning of end of May, and then from the end of May to the end of June, I just turned 20, and I decided I would make a portfolio of DC characters. I didn't think I was qualified enough to get work at Marvel. I didn't think my work was good enough, but I saw the kind of work that was being done in DC, and I thought I had a shot. And because Neal Adams was sort of the biggest influence for me growing up, so I thought, even though I had started to move away from Neal, I thought, well, comic books, Neal Adams, I'm going to try to get into comics, so I'll go back and do some of the Neal Adams stuff for my portfolio, because I know that and I would see other guys doing Neal. I did a portfolio of like 15 to 20 pieces in a month. Didn't have an appointment, didn't call ahead, just took the train in, which was like, from where I lived, it was probably 3 or 4 hours, switching trains and stuff. And went in with my brown polyester suit and my Eiffel Tower tie and my checkered pants and, clodhopper shoes, and just sat there in the lobby of DC waiting to get it to be seen by the art director, who was actually Vinny Coletta, who was an inker, but he was sort of bumped up to being art director and submissions editor. I was hoping that I would get a critique and that I might get a pinup. What I'd hoped for was that they would say, come back in a year, come back in 6 months, come back or don't come back at all. Because I thought let me just see, because if I don't get anything, then I will go back to finish my final year of art school and then I'll decide. But it's like, let me just see what happens. Now when you go up to a corporate office like Marvel or DC, you got to give your driver's license, your blood type, next of kin and all this other. Back then it was just like, I'm just sitting there just waiting, people are coming and going, and I literally sat in that lobby for like 3 hours. And I wasn't gonna move. I was like, I am just gonna stay here, And I was too naive or dumb or ignorant to be afraid. It was like, it was almost like I think I set my goal so low that if I get a pinup or if I get them to even look at it, they'll give me at least some feedback so that it'll give me something to focus on for when I go back to art school. And Vinny Coletta said, he said, I love your stuff. And he said, I could hire you for a job. And I was like really, surprised. But he said, you'll be out on the streets in in a week or two. Because it was during what was called the DC implosion. And to this day, I'm not 100% sure, but all I know is that, they were hemorrhaging creative people. And so he said, let me call Neal Adams, because he saw the influence. And I was like, I started to get really nervous. And because I'd seen Neal at a convention, and then I'd never really spoke with him. I was like, he was like my God, He called up Neal, and then somebody who was on their way over to continuity walked me over. Neal looked at my work and he sort of spread it out in front of, on the flat files, and like just started looking over it. And I think Alan Weiss he spent the majority of his time making fun of my tie. Nice Eiffel Tower tie. I think we just like, who is this rube? Alan, I love Alan. It's like we came, but I was literally, not only wet behind the ears, but green. And they're looking at the work, and Neal is like, just talking about, how styles are influenced, about what we do wrong defines our styles. And he was holding court around my portfolio. And I started to get like these butterflies, because he goes, I'm gonna call Jim Shooter. I want him to see your work. And he went into the other room, and he came back in, and he goes, here's the directions over to Marvel. So I was like sort of like this ping pong ball. I went over to Marvel. Jim Owsley, Christopher Priest, who was an intern, and he actually said, there's a kid out in the lobby that Neal Adams sent over, do you want to put, and he said to his friend Elliot Brown, who was not an editor, said, why don't you, got another submissions here, a kid, it's like, why don't you pretend to be the editor, and it was like they had a routine, because he was all set to basically just rake me over the coals, and just bust my bubble and my ass as well, my chops. And then he went into the editors and he said, I think you should see this kid's work. And it was like he was sort of, when he told me this, he was sort of deflated, because he was all set to kind of rip me a new one. And apparently the work actually was good. So they said, we can definitely give you work. They were trying to figure out, they said, obviously it's like I'm at Marvel with a portfolio of nothing but DC characters. And Shooter, and I remember just being like stunned by Shooter, because he was so tall. Like he actually, stood up and put his foot up on a desk. Most people put it up on a chair and put their arm on their knee. He was like, he did it with the desk, without effort. And I'm just like, and he's talking to me about my storytelling, and he goes, costumes don't matter. You can draw any kind of costume. It doesn't matter. We know that you can do it. And we can give you work. You have to sign a work for hire contract. It was like, whatever you want, And they said, we want to do this, this character called Moon Knight, because I think they felt that it was sort of, they were doing these fast, computations about saying, well, what character would be like Batman that would fit? And so they pulled Moon Knight together, and I had no idea who the character was, I'd read a lot of Marvel and DC, but for some reason I never read Werewolf by Night. That kind of slipped through the cracks for me. But so I was up there. They're offering me Moon Knight and to do a not just a pinup or a critique. They're like offering me a series. Like all of a sudden I've got this career. It was like completely mind blowing. And what was funny is that I remember on the train ride down, I took an old Erie-Lackawanna train, from Dover, which is where the Kubert School is now. But it was one of those old, rickety trains with the wicker seats and the seat backs that they'd ratchet, to one position. So if you're going to New York, they'd pull the seat backs. It was on a pivot, the seat back, so everybody was facing the way you were going. And, if you stood up, you'd end up with, you'd have a lattice print on the back of your thighs if you were sitting on them in the summer. They would break, and there were cigarette burns in them, and, the windows were completely, amber because of the smell, the smoking. And on the way back, for some reason, I ended up getting on a commuter train that was like air conditioned and super quiet, and all these people in suits and ties, and the sun is going down, and I'm like going like, just remember this. This is like, it was like all it was missing was a soundtrack from a Scorsese movie or something like that, That's what it just felt like. This is like, my life is different.